Mark and Emily's picture-perfect marriage looked flawless to everyone on the outside, but behind closed doors it was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. When a shocking TV show exposed Emily's hidden affair to the entire nation, the humiliation pushed Mark past the edge. What started as whispers of betrayal soon spiraled into rage, obsession, and an irreversible act of violence that would turn their suburban home into the center of a chilling true crime story. Michael Turner's life looked simple from the outside, but beneath the calm surface, everything was starting to crumble. He was a 45-year-old auto mechanic, known in his town for being steady, reliable, and hardworking. His neighbors respected him, and his customers trusted him with their vehicles. He had built a modest life over the years, carving out a reputation as a man of discipline and loyalty. With his wife, Lavra, he had raised 2 children, a teenage son and daughter, in a neat suburban home that always seemed to reflect stability. To anyone glancing from afar, the Turners looked like an unshakable family built on love and commitment. But appearances can be fragile, and Michael was about to discover how quickly everything he thought was solid could collapse. Lavra had been different lately. Michael noticed it in the little things first, the way she avoided his eyes at dinner, the way she smiled faintly while checking her phone, the way her excuses piled up with errands that stretched long into the night. He brushed these things aside at first, telling himself she was just tired, stressed, maybe going through something personal, but each excuse cut deeper. The trust he had taken for granted began to tremble, though he forced himself to believe that he still knew her heart. After all, this was the woman he had married 15 years ago, the woman who had stood with him through financial struggles, family illnesses, and the endless grind of daily life. He clung to the idea that their bond was unbreakable. Michael had always been cautious by nature. He wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions or let suspicion rule him. He had grown up in a house where trust was sacred, and he wanted to hold on to that value. But every night, when Lavra came home late or smiled at her phone, he felt that value slipping through his hands. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying small moments, searching for hidden meanings in her words, trying to piece together a puzzle he desperately hoped didn't exist. The fear that something was wrong gnawed at him quietly, like a shadow creeping closer each day. Then one night, while flipping through television channels, something happened that would shatter his world. He wasn't looking for answers when he stumbled upon the show. It was a reality program, notorious for catching unfaithful partners and exposing their secret lives in front of the camera. Michael had heard about it before, but he had never paid much attention. That night, however, the screen froze him in place. He saw a woman who looked familiar, dressed in a way he recognized, her hair falling across her shoulders just like Laura's. At first, he thought it was a cruel coincidence, someone resembling her. But as the camera followed the woman walking into a restaurant, holding the hand of another man, Michael's stomach turned cold. The necklace around her neck was the same one he had given Lavra on their 10th wedding anniversary. The footage was grainy, filmed with hidden cameras, but Michael's eyes locked on every detail. He saw her laugh with the man across the table, her body language open and affectionate in ways she hadn't been with him in months. He watched her lean into the man, whispering in his ear, smiling in a way she no longer smiled at home. Then came the worst moment, the two of them walking into a hotel, disappearing together behind a closing door. Michael sat paralyzed, his hands numb, his heart hammering. He could not deny it anymore. His wife, the woman he trusted, had been living a double life, and now the truth was playing out on national television for strangers to consume. The producers blurred her face, as they often did, but Michael didn't need to see it clearly. He knew the way she walked, the way she held her purse, even the way she tilted her head when laughing. These were details only a husband could recognize, and he recognized them with absolute certainty. The world might see her as another anonymous cheater, but Michael saw her as his wife, the woman who had shared his bed, his dreams, and his family. The humiliation was unbearable. He imagined the thousands of people watching the show, laughing or shaking their heads, never knowing that the woman in the footage was his. He could not escape the cruel irony. Strangers were now witnesses to his private betrayal before he had even confronted it himself. Michael's body tensed as rage and despair collided inside him. He sat staring at the screen long after the episode ended, his mind looping the images again and again. It wasn't just the affair, it was the way it had been revealed. Not quietly, not privately, but in the most humiliating way possible. The intimacy of his marriage had been turned into entertainment for an audience. His wife's betrayal had been packaged, edited, and broadcast like a spectacle, and he was left to pick up the pieces. Sleep never came that night. Michael sat in silence, replaying 15 years of memories. He remembered their wedding day, Laura's smile when she held their newborn son, the vacations they scraped money together to take, the nights they sat on the porch watching sunsets. Every memory now felt poisoned, twisted by the knowledge that she had chosen someone else. His mind replayed the moment the hotel door closed behind her, and he wondered how many other doors had closed over the years without him knowing. By morning, Michael's life no longer felt like his own. The certainty he once carried, the steady routine, the quiet evenings, the small joys, was gone. In its place stood a storm of anger, humiliation, and grief. He had spent years working for his family, building a home he thought was safe. But the truth had been ripped from him on a screen, leaving him exposed and broken. He didn't tell anyone about what he had seen, not even Laura. She went about her morning as though nothing had happened, preparing coffee, scrolling through her phone, avoiding his gaze. To her, the secret was still intact, hidden behind silence. To Michael, there was no secret left. There was only betrayal, undeniable and public. That night marked the beginning of his downfall, though he couldn't see it yet. The humiliation carved into him by a television broadcast was deeper than any wound he had ever known. And while he said nothing to Laura, while he pretended for a time that he could hold it together, the truth was already burning inside him like a fuse waiting to ignite. The days after the television broadcast were suffocating for Michael. He carried the weight of what he had seen like a stone pressing on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him. At work, his coworkers acted the same, but Michael imagined their glances had changed. Every laugh in the distance sounded like mockery. Every whisper felt like it was about him. It didn't matter if no one had connected the blurred face on the screen to Laura. Michael was sure the whole town knew. He became hyper-aware of every interaction, every small smile, every handshake. He convinced himself that people were pitying him, judging him, or simply waiting to see how long it would take before he broke down. At home, the silence was heavier than ever. Laura moved through their house as though nothing had happened. She still made dinner, still scrolled endlessly on her phone, still came home late with weak excuses. Not once did she bring up the television show. She didn't confess, didn't attempt to explain, didn't even acknowledge the possibility that Michael might have seen it. Her avoidance cut him deeper than words ever could. The woman he had shared his life with had turned into a stranger living under the same roof, and her silence screamed louder than any admission. Michael tried to distract himself, burying his thoughts in work. He stayed longer at the shop, tinkering with cars even after closing hours, telling himself he was too busy to think about Laura. But the images from the show always crept back into his mind, the hotel door shutting, her hand in another man's, her laugh ringing out in ways she hadn't laughed with him in months. The humiliation twisted into obsession. He wanted to know every detail. Who was the man? How long had it been happening? Did she ever feel guilty when she came home to him afterward? These questions haunted him day and night, gnawing at his sanity. At night, when he couldn't sleep, Michael replayed the past 15 years in his head. He thought about the times Laura had claimed she was working late. He remembered family holidays when she seemed distracted, nights when she slipped into the bathroom to answer her phone in whispers. All the small moments he once brushed aside now felt like glaring evidence. He wondered how many times he had been blind. How many times had she looked him in the eyes, kissed him goodnight, and then gone behind his back. He had built his marriage on the belief that Laura was faithful, and now he realized he had built his life on lies. The show's footage didn't just confirm his worst fears, it made them public. That was what stung the most. If he had discovered the affair quietly, through a text message or a rumor, he might have handled it differently. But knowing that strangers had already watched her betrayal turned his pain into humiliation. Somewhere out there, thousands of people had seen his wife hold another man's hand, kiss him, walk into a hotel with him. To them, it was just another episode of cheap entertainment. To Michael, it was the destruction of everything he had ever trusted. The anger grew each day, burning hotter the more Lavra pretended nothing had changed. He studied her movements carefully, noticing every smile, every sigh, every excuse. He convinced himself that she was still seeing the man from the show, sneaking out to meet him, carrying on the affair while Michael played the fool. The more he watched her, the more certain he became. His house no longer felt like home. It felt like a cage filled with secrets. One evening, while sitting at the dinner table, Michael found himself staring at Lavra across from him. She was eating quietly, scrolling her phone between bites, her face lit by the screen's glow. He looked at her and felt like he was staring at a stranger who had replaced the woman he once loved. The betrayal was no longer abstract, it was sitting in front of him, breathing the same air. His mind filled with dark images of Lavra with the other man. He imagined their hands touching, their whispers in the night, the intimacy she had once reserved for him. The pictures tormented him, but he couldn't stop them from flooding in. Michael tried to confront her once, but the words caught in his throat. He stood in the kitchen, gripping the counter, wanting to scream, wanting to demand the truth. But when Lavra walked in, smiling faintly and asking if he had eaten, he froze. He said nothing. He swallowed his rage, burying it deeper. He told himself he needed proof. He couldn't risk asking her and being lied to again. He needed to catch her himself, see it with his own eyes, hear it with his own ears. Only then could he decide what to do. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing day. Their children noticed, but said nothing, tiptoeing around the tension that filled the house. Michael spent more time in the garage, avoiding Lavra as much as possible. But avoidance didn't ease his pain, it only made it fester. The more time he spent alone, the more his thoughts turned violent. He imagined confronting the man Jason, whoever he was. He imagined Lavra begging for forgiveness, imagined himself turning away, imagined ending it all in one final, explosive moment. The tipping point came when Michael overheard Lavra on the phone late at night. She was in the bedroom, speaking in hushed tones, her voice filled with warmth he hadn't heard in years. Michael stood outside the door, his fists clenched, his heart pounding so hard it shook his body. He couldn't hear the words clearly, but he didn't need to. The tone was enough. She was still seeing him. She was still lying. She was still betraying everything they had built together. Michael returned to the garage, sitting in silence among the tools and broken car parts. His rage boiled over, but he kept it contained, pressing it down into something colder, sharper. He no longer thought about saving his marriage or winning her back. The idea of forgiveness was gone. In its place was a burning need for control, for closure, for an end to the humiliation that had consumed him. The days stretched into weeks, each one worse than the last. Michael's obsession grew until it was all he could think about. He couldn't focus on work, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat without imagining Lavra with someone else. Every small sign, her smile, her excuses, her phone buzzing late at night fueled his certainty that he was living with a stranger. And as the weight of his humiliation pressed harder, his thoughts darkened into something irreversible. He began to plan, though he didn't admit it to himself at first. The idea started as a shadow in the back of his mind. But it grew stronger each day, whispering to him, pushing him closer to a choice that would destroy everything. Michael's decision to follow Lavra began quietly, like a thought he couldn't push away. It started one sleepless night as he sat in the garage, staring at the oil-stained floor. His mind replayed the sound of her late-night whispers, the muffled laughter he had heard through the bedroom door. He couldn't take it anymore, he needed to know for certain. The television show had given him a glimpse, but it wasn't enough. His imagination filled in the blanks with tormenting images, each one worse than the last. He told himself he had to see it with his own eyes. Only then could he decide what to do. The next evening he waited. Lavra claimed she was going to visit a friend after work, the same excuse she had used countless times. She left the house dressed with more care than usual, her hair carefully styled, perfume clinging faintly to her. Michael watched her walk out the door, his body stiff with anger, his mind already racing ahead. As soon as she drove off, he followed in his truck, keeping a few cars back, headlights dimmed so she wouldn't notice. The drive stretched across town, each red light giving him more time to think. His knuckles turned white against the steering wheel, his chest tight with rage. He wondered if she thought about him at all while she laughed with the other man, if she ever pictured her husband following close behind, watching her betrayal unfold. He wanted to believe she might feel guilt, but the way she smiled into her phone earlier that evening told him otherwise. Eventually, Laura's car pulled into a diner parking lot. Michael parked a short distance away, his heart hammering in his chest as he watched her step out and walk toward the entrance. Moments later, another car pulled up and a man climbed out. He was younger, dressed casually, with a confidence in the way he moved. Michael didn't need to be told who he was. He recognized him instantly from the show. This was Jason, the man who had taken his wife from him, the man who had ruined everything. Michael sat frozen as he watched them embrace, her arms wrapping around Jason as though he belonged to her. They entered the diner together, laughing, their hands brushing against one another as if no one else in the world existed. Michael's vision blurred with rage. Every smile, every touch, every moment was like a knife twisting in his chest. He stayed in his truck, gripping the wheel, his body trembling. He could go inside, confront them, demand answers. But something told him to wait. He needed more than a scene in a diner. He needed to know the truth in full, no denials, no excuses. When they left the diner, Michael's breath quickened. He started the truck and followed them as they drove across town again. His worst fears became reality when he saw them pull into the parking lot of a small motel. They got out of the car together, hands intertwined. Their bodies leaning close in a way that spoke of intimacy Michael hadn't shared with Laura in years. He watched them disappear into a room, the door shutting behind them, sealing the truth in silence. Michael sat in the darkness of his truck, his mind spinning. He no longer needed the television show or his imagination to tell him the truth. He had seen it now, undeniable and raw. His wife had chosen another man, and she had done so boldly, without shame, without care for the family she was tearing apart. The betrayal was complete, and Michael's world had collapsed. He drove home in silence, his hands shaking on the wheel. When Laura returned hours later, she carried herself as if nothing had happened. She walked into the house calmly, greeted him with the same faint smile, and moved through their routine like the evening had been ordinary. To her, perhaps it was. To Michael, it was the night everything inside him changed. From that day forward, Michael's silence was different. It wasn't the silence of denial anymore, it was the silence of planning. He began to think about Jason constantly, picturing the man with his wife, imagining what they whispered to each other in the dark. Each thought added fuel to the fire burning inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that Jason wasn't just having an affair with Laura, he was taking everything from Michael. His pride, his marriage, his family stability, even his identity as a husband. It was all slipping into Jason's hands. Michael searched for information about him. He discovered Jason was one of Laura's co-workers at her office. He was younger, single, and free from the responsibilities of marriage and children. Michael pictured Laura being drawn to that freedom, to the charm of someone who didn't carry the weight of bills, broken appliances, and endless work shifts. He began to hate Jason not just for the affair, but for what he represented. To Michael, Jason was a reminder of everything he had lost, everything he could never be again. The anger became obsession. Michael found himself driving past Jason's apartment after work, watching from his truck, memorizing the man's movements. He learned his routine, the time he left for work, the time he returned home, the way he carried himself with careless ease. Michael felt like a predator circling prey, though he didn't admit it to himself. He told himself he was gathering proof, building an understanding of the man who had ruined his life. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He was preparing for something bigger, something irreversible. At home, the distance between Michael and Laura grew wider. He stopped trying to talk to her, stopped pretending. He answered her questions with short, empty responses, his eyes cold and distant. Laura seemed to notice, but she didn't confront him. Perhaps she thought her secret was still safe, that her lies still held weight. But Michael knew better. He was no longer the man she thought she could deceive. He was someone else now, someone harder, someone more dangerous. Every day he replayed the scene at the motel in his mind, the way she touched Jason, the way she smiled at him. It was more than betrayal. It was humiliation, carved deep into his soul. He couldn't eat without tasting bitterness, couldn't sleep without visions of them together haunting him. His life no longer felt like his own. It felt stolen, stripped away by two people who had cared nothing for his dignity or his love. Michael's thoughts grew darker. He started to imagine scenarios, violent confrontations, ways to end the torment. These thoughts frightened him at first, but the more he entertained them, the more they felt like inevitabilities. He told himself he wanted justice, closure, an end to the humiliation, but what he really wanted was revenge. He wanted Lavra to feel the weight of what she had done, and he wanted Jason to pay for daring to touch what was his. The man who once lived a quiet life as a mechanic, who once believed in loyalty and trust, was gone. In his place stood someone consumed by rage and humiliation, someone whose world had been reduced to betrayal and obsession. And as Michael sharpened his thoughts, as his silence deepened, he crossed the line from suspicion to certainty, from hurt to hatred. He no longer thought about repairing his marriage or protecting his children from the fallout. He thought only about how to take back the control he felt had been stolen from him. The night it all came apart began like so many others. Lavra was late coming home again, her excuses rehearsed and thin. Michael sat in the living room, the glow of the television painting shadows across his face. The sound from the screen was little more than background noise. He wasn't watching. He was waiting. Hours ticked by, the clock on the wall echoing with every second. On the coffee table in front of him lay the gun he had owned for years but rarely touched. He had bought it back when the kids were small, telling himself it was for protection, though it had stayed hidden most of its life. That night it wasn't hidden. That night it was sitting in plain view, heavy and black, a silent presence in the room. Michael's mind was a storm. The images of Lavra and Jason together played on a loop, each memory sharper than the last. The laughter in the diner, the embrace in the parking lot, the closing door of the motel, it was all carved into him like scars he couldn't erase. He tried to picture the life he once had, the family dinners, the Sunday mornings, the sense of pride in the home they built. But every good memory was poisoned now, twisted into reminders of everything he had lost. The anger swelled inside him until it became unbearable, pressing against his chest like a weight. He told himself he couldn't live like this anymore. When the sound of Laura's car pulling into the driveway reached his ears, Michael's heart began to pound. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the intensity of everything boiling inside him. He picked up the gun and stared at it, his reflection dimly visible on its surface. He thought of his children upstairs, asleep in their rooms, unaware of the storm about to break. He thought of the humiliation he had carried for weeks, the whispers he imagined from neighbors and co-workers, the cruel truth that his life had become a spectacle for strangers. The decision he had resisted for so long no longer felt like a choice, it felt like the only path left. Lavra walked through the front door, her keys jingling as she dropped them onto the counter. She looked tired, but not in the way Michael expected. There was no guilt in her face, no fear, only the calm of someone who believed her secret was still intact. She glanced at him briefly, offering a faint smile as though everything were normal. That smile pushed him over the edge. It was the same smile she had given Jason, the same smile that had once belonged to him alone. Now it was nothing but a mask, a reminder of how deeply she had deceived him. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the hum of the television. Michael stood, the gun cold in his hand, his breath unsteady. The words he had rehearsed in his head so many times never came out. There was nothing left to say. Words wouldn't erase the humiliation. Words wouldn't undo the betrayal. All that remained was the action he had been circling for weeks. The first shot rang out like thunder, echoing through the house. Laura's eyes widened in shock, her body jerking back as the bullet struck. She stumbled, a sound escaping her lips that was more confusion than pain. Michael fired again, the second shot tearing through the silence with even greater force. The smell of gunpowder filled the room, acrid and suffocating, mixing with the sharp metallic scent of blood. Lavra collapsed to the floor, her body crumpling against the carpet. Her eyes were still open, staring up at him in disbelief, as though she couldn't understand what had just happened. Michael stood frozen, the gun still raised, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. The ringing in his ears drowned out everything else, the television, the clock, the world outside. For a long moment he could only stare at what he had done, his mind struggling to catch up with his actions. He expected to feel relief, but it didn't come. The rage that had driven him was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that spread through him like ice. His wife was lying dead at his feet, the woman he had built a life with, the mother of his children, the person he once thought he couldn't live without, and he was the one who had taken her away. The reality of it hit him in waves, each one harder than the last. The sound of movement upstairs snapped him out of his trance. His children, they had heard the gunshots. Their lives too had just been shattered, though they didn't yet know it. Michael lowered the gun slowly, his hands still trembling, his heart sinking under the weight of what he had done. He imagined their faces when they came down the stairs, imagined their fear, their confusion. He had not only destroyed his marriage, he had destroyed their family forever. Outside, a neighbor's light flicked on. Someone had heard the noise. The world was already closing in on him. Sirens were inevitable, voices at the door, questions he couldn't answer. Michael sank onto the couch, the gun slipping from his fingers onto the cushion beside him. He buried his face in his hands, the tears coming hard and fast now, too late to change anything. The house was eerily quiet except for the muffled sound of his children crying upstairs. Michael didn't call out to them. He couldn't. He had crossed a line there was no coming back from. The silence that once suffocated him now felt like judgment, pressing down on him, reminding him of the finality of what he had done. Minutes passed like hours. He sat motionless, staring at the floor, his mind a blur of memories and regrets. He thought of the first time he met Lavra, the way her laugh had filled the room, the promises they had made on their wedding day. He thought of the children they had raised together, the birthdays, the holidays, the small moments that had once meant everything. All of it was gone now, replaced by a single act of violence that would define him for the rest of his life. When the sound of distant sirens finally reached his ears, Michael didn't move. He didn't run, didn't try to hide. There was nowhere left to go. The rage that had driven him was gone, leaving only exhaustion. He sat in silence, waiting for the knock at the door, the voices shouting, commands, the handcuffs that would seal his fate. The night that began like so many others had ended in blood. The man who had once been known as a steady, reliable mechanic was now something else entirely. He had become a murderer, his life forever tied to a single moment of rage and despair. And as the sirens grew louder, Michael realized the humiliation he had feared was nothing compared to the devastation he had brought upon himself and everyone he loved. The flashing red and blue lights lit up the street outside the Turner home as officers rushed toward the front door. Neighbors gathered at their windows, whispering in disbelief at the commotion unraveling in their quiet neighborhood. For years, the Turners had been the image of stability, a family that seemed immune to the chaos of the outside world. But now, police tape would soon stretch across their yard, and their home would forever be remembered not for Sunday barbecues or holiday gatherings, but for a brutal murder. Inside, Michael sat slumped on the couch, the gun lying on the cushion beside him. He didn't resist when officers burst in, weapons drawn, shouting commands. He barely moved at all, his hands shaking as he lifted them in surrender. His face was pale, hollow, as if every drop of energy had drained from him. Laura's body lay sprawled on the floor only feet away, her blood seeping into the carpet. The officer's eyes shifted between the man who had pulled the trigger and the woman who had paid the price. The scene was one of those that stuck with investigators long after they left, a haunting picture of betrayal and rage turned fatal. Michael spoke only once as they cuffed him and led him out of the house. His voice was flat, stripped of emotion. He said that the television show had exposed everything. The officers didn't press him for more. They had heard confessions like this before, words born out of guilt and madness. But later, when the story came out, that single sentence would hang over the entire case like a shadow. The news spread fast. By the next morning, headlines told of the suburban husband who shot his wife after discovering her affair. The twist that gripped the public was the television angle that the betrayal had been caught on camera and broadcast to thousands before Michael acted. It was a story that blurred the lines between entertainment and tragedy, raising questions that echoed far beyond the small town where it happened. Was the show responsible for fueling Michael's rage? Did the producers understand the destruction they were playing with when they aired such footage? Or was the blame solely Michael's for allowing his humiliation to transform into violence? The courtroom was packed when the trial began months later. Journalists filled the benches, their pens ready to capture every detail. Spectators leaned in, eager for the kind of story that was both shocking and familiar, another tale of love gone wrong, of betrayal that ended in blood. Prosecutors painted Michael as a man who had let jealousy consume him until he could no longer control himself. They described him as cold, calculating, waiting for Lavra to return home that night so he could end her life. They argued that millions of people had watched Laura's betrayal and endured nothing more than disgust or pity, but Michael had chosen murder. The defense countered with a different story. They argued that Michael had been pushed to the breaking point by the public exposure of his private humiliation. They described him as a man who had given 15 years to his family, only to have it all destroyed in the most humiliating way possible. They spoke of the television program as a kind of instigator, a machine that exploited private lives for entertainment without considering the consequences. To them, Michael wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He was a broken man, cornered by betrayal and public shame until he snapped. Laura's family sat in the courtroom each day, their faces heavy with grief. They spoke of her as a mother, a sister, a daughter, someone who deserved a chance to rebuild her life, even if she had made mistakes. Her affair, they said, didn't warrant her execution. Michael's children, too young to sit through the trial, lived with relatives now, their futures torn apart by the violence of that night. Their mother was gone, and their father faced life behind bars. The family unit they once knew no longer existed. As the trial stretched on, the media kept feeding the public with new details. They revealed Jason's name, publishing photos of him that circulated widely. He never testified, but his presence loomed over the case. Reporters hunted for him, digging into his personal life, labeling him the other man who had unknowingly ignited a murder. He moved out of town not long after, unable to escape the attention. Though he wasn't responsible for the crime, his role in the tragedy was etched into the story forever. When the jury finally delivered their verdict, the courtroom was silent. Guilty of murder. Michael sat motionless as the words were read, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't even look surprised. It was as if he had known from the beginning that this would be the outcome. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, ensuring he would never walk free again. The case closed with finality, but the questions it raised lingered in the public's mind. The television network behind the reality show faced heavy criticism. Commentators debated whether such programs exploited people's lives for ratings without considering the fallout. Some argued that the producers had blood on their hands, while others insisted that Michael alone bore responsibility for his actions. Lawsuits were threatened, though none succeeded. The show continued airing, its audience bigger than ever, feeding off the very scandal it had helped create. In prison, Michael lived quietly, fading into the background. He didn't cause trouble, didn't draw attention to himself. Guards described him as broken, a man carrying a burden too heavy to lift. He rarely spoke of Lavra, but when he did, his words were filled with regret. He admitted that nothing could excuse what he had done, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been pushed into a corner he couldn't escape. For the children left behind, life would never return to normal. They grew up in the shadow of a tragedy they had not chosen, haunted by the memory of sirens outside their home, the knowledge of what their father had done, and the loss of their mother. The Turner house was eventually sold, but the stain of what happened there remained. Neighbors still pointed it out to visitors, whispering the story of the family that had fallen apart in the most violent way possible. The story of Michael and Lavra Turner lived on not just as another true crime case, but as a cautionary tale about love, betrayal, and the dangers of public exposure. What had started as entertainment on a television screen ended as blood on a living room floor. The lines between private pain and public spectacle blurred. leaving behind a tragedy that raised questions about responsibility, humiliation, and the choices people make when they feel the world is laughing at them. Michael's final words to investigators, that the television show had exposed everything, became the most quoted line of the case. Some saw it as an excuse, others as an insight into his broken state of mind. Either way, it captured the heart of the story, a man's private humiliation turned into public shame, spiraling into violence. In the end, no one walked away unscathed. Lavra was dead, Michael was imprisoned, Jason was forced into hiding, and the children were left to carry the weight of their parents' choices. The case was retold in documentaries, podcasts, and late-night discussions, each version adding to the legend of what had happened. People debated who was most at fault: Laura for her betrayal, Michael for his violence, Jason for his involvement, or the producers who broadcast the affair to the world. But no amount of discussion could change the reality. One family was destroyed, one life was taken, and one man's decision to pull the trigger turned a quiet suburban street into the site of a tragedy no one would ever forget.